Okay, it says it's live or recording. Yeah, hello people. I feel the necessity to get a little video out. This video is a little bit of my frustration about the shite that gets talked about the flat earth, especially when people call the quest for objective truth a debate. So I'm fucking fed up of listening to all these fucking morons continuously making out as if this is some kind of debate. Objective reality cannot be debated. It is there to be discussed because we all have the same experiences, and what we can do is discuss those experiences, but there's no point in debating and defending positions of ideology. Now, when I see platforms talking about this for fucking years, going round in circles, more muddying of the waters than doing any real good, because this stuff is real fucking simple, people. The visible world has been hijacked and is not being properly differentiated from the physical world. That's the main thing you need to understand. There's a whole geometry around how the visible world behaves. It has a lot to do with your eye. And to be quite honest, it doesn't have anything to do with perspective. The word perspective is the mathematical rules to take a 3D scene and transport that onto a 2D planar surface by means of, as I say, mathematical geometrical rules. That's what perspective means. What we're talking about here is the whole geometry underlying the visible world, the physiology of your eye, how light behaves. So these are bigger topics than just focusing on the word perspective and going around in circles talking about images and images and images and fighting and debating with globers who don't want to understand what's going on, or they're deliberately being obtuse to do it. And I have to question those flat earth channels that do the same, that continually make this out as if it's some kind of fucking running competition. So that out of the way, I'm going to just give a little bit of overview of my take on that whole situation. I want to point people to certain links, documents, materials, so that people can discern this for themselves. So I'm just going to share my screen. All right. So everybody should be seeing my screen. I have a public drive on Google. The link will be provided in the description box of this video itself. I'd like people to at least know that this material is here, and hopefully it will help them discern a little bit better what all this thing means. I'm just going to step through some of these files that are there. I encourage people to have a look at them. I'm going to start with this one here. Now, this is just a picture. This is one PNG file, and it's my attempt to categorize the different so-called sciences or so-called natural phenomena into two different categories. One that takes place in your visible space, and another one that takes place in our physical space. So I'm going to start with the physical space, because this is me and you and the substances of which we are made, walking around on a level plane. Of course, it has hills and valleys, but basically you're on a level plane, and it's a Euclidean geometry. Euclidean geometry means I can go X and Y, I can go left and right, and forward and backward, and I can also, to a limited extent, increase my altitude and go up and down. Now, we're not very good at that. We need fucking machines to help us do that. Sure, we can walk to the top of a mountain, but you can only jump a couple of feet. Well, maybe 5 feet. So the geometry of physical space has everything to do with what we normally understand to be substances. We are in this physical space, so our chemistry, our biology, these are things that live in the physical world. Everything that we do with construction has to do with you using Euclidean geometry, which is our planar geometry, planar principles, and that's what we use to build every single thing that we see in the world, and that we live in the world, and that we utilize in the world, is using that geometry. And that is the geometry of physical space. You can call it Cartesian, you can call it Euclidean. Basically, all of the engineering, all of the construction business, all of the transport business, anything to do with mechanics, and that includes the mechanics in the way you move as a physical being, or the way we get around in any situation. All of these things have to do with physical space. Now, it's quite simple. If you just shut your eyes and walk around, you're going to bump into stuff. But that is your physical world. When I say physical world, I mean it's scale invariant. You can move from one place to another. You will not change shape or size. Neither will the objects in your physical space do that. If you translate them from one place to another, nothing is changing apart from the position of those objects in your physical space. Now, because we come to life with a common sense package that we can call basically common sense, which is all your faculties attached to your sense organs, then you know fine well what is parallel and what is perpendicular, what's level, what's plumb, what's planar. You have a direct and immediate experience of everything in your reality. This is based on your constitution, i.e. the way you're made up, your constituent parts of whoever, whatever made us, and the reason for why we're here and all these things I'm not going to go into, but just look at your own constitution, understand that you have a lung sac that pumps, you have a heart that beats, you have eyes that can see, you have other sensory equipment, auditory, touchables, your skin. All these things are made up in natural science and have everything to do with the physiology of you. Then, at the end of the day, we have our human nature, we have the way our mind works, we have lived life, and this physical reality that we're all experiencing is an objective one. The external world is objective for each person on this planet. It's not your subjective feeling about things, it's an objective reality that we all share. Now, the geometry of visible space is the huge deception that has happened. Scientists do not recognize the geometry of visible space. Scientists ignore the geometry of visible space. The geometry of visibles, i.e. things that we see, are completely different geometry from the geometry of physical space. The geometry of visible space is spherical. It has different attributes to the planar physical world we live in. It has everything to do with measuring angles subtended at the eye or at the optical instrument, and that's used in all kinds of pseudosciences. Astronomy. Navigation is not a science in itself. Yeah, it's using the celestial sphere and some assumptions about concentric circles and concentric shells so that we can navigate here down on Earth pretending that we're living on a ball. We have dialing, which is everything to do with clocks, the way the sun moves. Again, these are just applications of the geometry of visible space being projected onto a planar surface. Everything that we understand about time, about surveying, about this nonsense geodesy, vision and sight, and even down to art and perspective and Renaissance painting. These are all things that have more to do with the geometry of visible space than they do with anything else. And I've put some other words in here. So the big thing is to understand that the geometry of visible space has been hijacked, basically using mathematical trickery. Or mathematical sophistry is a better word. I don't think mathematicians are out to trick anybody. I just know for a fact that they do not look at the geometry of visible space. That's been relegated to neuroscience, to psychology, whereas it shouldn't be. It should be a part of the natural world. If we are all going to be quantifying our experiences in the natural world and taking them to be true, then the geometry of visible space needs to be factored into this and factored in properly. Because otherwise, the geometry of visible space is going to be used in all of those sciences in a way that people don't understand. They're going to use fancy mathematics to say you're on a space ball. They're going to come up with other models and theories and notions from curved space-time to bullshit scale variance, depending on expanding universes or parallel universes, all kinds of bullshit you're going to get told. You're going to have beliefs and religions stuffed down your throat and cosmological worldviews that are basically just subjective things dreamed up by mathematicians and physicists. And what they're all not doing properly is making a clear differentiation between the geometry of visible space and the geometry of physical space. Perspective is just a small part of that. Now, I know everybody thinks perspective is the end-all, be-all, and of course the globes use visible proof seas as their big thing to try and make us all believe we're on a ball, ships going over the curve and all that pish. But please, people, look deeper than that. Look at the fundamentals of what's happening in the differentiation between the visible and the physical world. This isn't just about perspective or some photos on a P900. Sure, that debate was all over. As soon as you can see things that are supposed to be behind the curve, that already fucking blows the curve out of the water, yeah? And everybody knows that water is flat, absolutely level. No amount of mathematical sophistry to turn a straight line into a curve with no curvature and all that pish. None of that needs to work. You don't need to listen to all that, people. You just need to understand that water is always level from one side to the other. And there's nothing else that you really need to know. Because if you know that, then you also know that when things disappear into the distance, it has everything to do with the geometry of visual perception and the geometry of how your eye works. So there's a couple of other materials in here that I'd just like to point to for people who want to look more closer at how the eye works. I've got 2 GeoGebra files in here for quite a long time that people can download, install GeoGebra, play around with it. You'll see exactly how the diameters of the eye and visual perception and visual acuity and the limits that you have is all based on the spherical geometry. Yes, we have been deceived into thinking that we live on a spherical surface and we see through Euclidean planar eyes, and the opposite is true. You live in a Euclidean planar world and you have spherical vision, or a vision that is non-Euclidean geometry. And there are subtleties to that, but I'm just trying to keep it simple at the moment. Now, there's a whole bunch of materials in here that I'd just like to flick through very briefly. A reasonable start to our discussion is probably the first thing that people should look up and read and understand. This quote's heavily from my favorite guy, Thomas Reid. If nobody's heard of Thomas Reid, then it's really about time you did. An inquiry into the human mind on the principles of common sense is probably the best book ever written. It demolishes other philosophers, including Hume and Kant and all the big guys of the ages, because this guy got to the root of the problem. He was a polymath. He was a natural philosopher. He had a grounding and expertise in optics and physics and mathematics. So this guy wasn't just talking out his arse in some fucking hall room. This guy knew what he was doing. Now, basically, in this small presentation, it teaches you a little bit about one of the most important things is that first principles of reasoning you have to agree on with people before you can speak to them. Because if you don't have something, a foundation of which you both agree on, then you're going to talk past each other. And if you do that, then you're never going to get any kind of resolve or conclusion or agreement. So one of the first principles that everybody should agree on is that the quality of something has to be in a body. And that means something that is figured, colored, hard or soft, that moves or resists. That's what we call a body. And if people think that they can talk about stuff without material substances and bodies being involved, then they're full of shit. You can have abstract conversations about theoretical, fictional things, fairies, unicorns, forces that people can't see. You can have conversations about them. And you can maybe even, how should I say, delude yourself into thinking that an effect that you are seeing is really a cause of something. The typical nonsense that we get, mixing cause and effect, just because something has a correlation or something happens after something else, the so-called antecedent and consequent, then people think that they actually are tied together and one thing is the cause of another. No, the sun comes up every morning and it doesn't cause, the night doesn't cause the day and the day doesn't cause the night just because they come after each other. So one of the important things to realize is that you can't have a conversation with somebody who denies that qualities need to be attached to material substances. You need physical substances. If you're going to talk natural science, then you're going to have to talk about physical substances, material substances, and the qualities and the quantities of these things. And if you don't, if you're talking about gravity, fairy dust, or Tinkerbells, then you really don't understand what's going on here, and don't engage with people who don't agree with you on that first principle. The rest of this PowerPoint presentation contains very, very wise information about a whole multitude of things, and starts to look into a little bit exactly about how vision works. So have a look at that. You want to have a conversation with somebody, make sure you agree in first principles. This PowerPoint's a good one as well. If you want to look into this, it kind of documents a little bit the journey of the people beyond the imaginary curve, a platform which, as far as I'm concerned, is the go-to platform to get information, where myself, or I try at least as often as I can to be on that platform. Dell does a wonderful job of not only honing down the sciences and articulating properly what people should be looking at, but also the people who frequent that platform are honest inquirers, and not people out e-begging, looking for stature, fame. We just want the truth of what's out there. We don't care how it comes about. We don't care exactly what people join. I mean, everybody's welcome, but at the same time, you have to bring honesty and integrity to the conversation and leave money out of it completely. I say that's just my opinion. I believe money always can be problematic. If you bring money into equations, then generally speaking, the truth tends to suffer. So this is a very good presentation, if you ask me, even though I did it myself, that tries to outline a little bit of what it was that BTIC brought to the table. I'm not touting myself here. I'm touting everybody who contributed to it. Obviously, Dale massively. Obviously, all the talking points that have been going on the BTIC platform that were then copied and plagiarized by others, and they thump it and bombard it and talk about it. And you have to pay money to listen to some guy espousing secondhand stuff. You want to come to BTIC people and look at the source of this information. So we know various things, that water does not bend, pressure requires a container. You'll see other people pounding those facts. But please, everybody, have a look at this presentation. It'll show you a little bit of all the things that BTIC has brought to the table. And what's important, at least as far as we're concerned, in getting the word out properly. This isn't about the quantity of interaction. It's not about having 2 fucking debate shows every fucking day. No, this is about getting quality information out there to the people, so that they differentiate and are empowered to look properly and research properly at what's going on. There's other material in here. If people want to understand what common sense is about, then there's a short presentation on common sense and why it's warranted and justified. Again, uses quotes, information from various academic sources to highlight to people exactly what common sense means and why we need it, and why common sense is the basis of all knowledge. Yes, you can have, a high abstract level of Platonic reasoning, but just think, people, you would not be even be able to do that if you did not come to this world with your sense organs and your ability to observe, your ability to relate and compare, your ability to discern things, to memorize them, to recall them, to ratiocinate, to put in ratio, put in relation, compare things to each other. That is the basis of common sense. And we are under a necessity to take them for granted. You cannot ignore the fact that you are a sentient being on this earth having these experiences. If you try and deny that or leave that out of your foundational reasoning, then you are in hairy fairyland. I've also got various things here about geometry and perspective. These are, generally speaking, PowerPoints that kind of triggered either some of the videos that I've made on my channel, Please have a look at those things. It will make you understand correctly what is the difference between visibles and tangibles, and where the problem is when we talk about the scientific. This is an extremely important slide, the geometry of touch and vision. There is a difference between the two. The geometry of touch measures the proportions of tangible figures and extensions with respect to each other, and the geometry of vision measures the intervals of visible figure and extension with respect to the eye. So that's you. You're walking around this plane, and all you can do with your visible world is measure angles. In the geometry of touch, it's not like that. You have real physical objects that have a width, a breadth, a height, and you can put something in a relation to each other with respect to each other. You can take a ruler along the sides, you can take the same ruler up the height and the width, and then you can say a proportion. Okay, let's say width to breadth to height is 4 to 4 to 2, or a piece of 4 by 2, as everybody knows who's done a bit of carpentry. So that is the geometry of touch, completely different from the geometry of vision, which can only rely on visual angles and visual separations. So please have a look at this PowerPoint, understand the things that have been done. I've given a few more examples of perspective and the reasons why with a globular spherical eye, things, if you are not equidistant between the two sides, let's say, for example, of a railway track, if you are not equidistant in the middle, but are actually closer to one side than you are to the other one, then things are going to behave closer to the one side that you're closer to. Things are going to behave differently. Things are going to disappear quicker. Things are going to be getting so small, the angles, that you're going to reach the limits of vision, which is about 1 arc minute. And if you continue, then you'll also find that at some point, about 0.36, you're going to hit the diffraction limit where 2-point sources of light will no longer be distinguishable by the naked eye, or by any optical instrument for that matter. That is a natural diffraction limit where these things will then smudge and smear, and you will not be able to discern two distinct points. That's why things disappear. And they disappear from the bottom up when you are not equidistant between the two things you're looking at. It can be the same with lampposts. It's the same with buildings disappearing. It's the same with the division of a fucking brick wall. These things, these similar parts that are made up in the quantification of this wall, bricks are similar parts made up in a wall, then the similar parts of things are going to disappear from you because of the limits of your vision. Same for up and down a corridor. Again, I would urge people to take a closer look at the GeoGebra, or look at the video, The Great Switcheroo, where these things are looked at in more detail. It's very obvious that this, if you like, is your eye. This is what you would see in a planar respect. But what's actually happening, this red rectangle or curvilinear rectangle, is what is actually happening on the back of your retina. Your retina is a curved surface. That's where the curve is, nowhere else. And the geometry of vision is the thing that you have to differentiate and discern if you want to see through this to see. Again, people, it's not all about perspective. It's about the geometry of the visible world. Why is it so important? Yeah, well, because there's a Gaussian curvature, the so-called remarkable theorem, theorema egregium. This was basically the idea from Gauss that the curvature of surface can be determined entirely by measuring angles and distances on the surface. It's an intrinsic measurement. Now, if you just think about this very briefly, you've got a fucking globe in an orbit in the middle of your head. You've got two of them, actually. Nature seems to give you two so that you've got a backup if you lose an ear or a fucking finger or a hand or an arm. At least you can get around because you've got another one. That would seem to me to be the main purpose of it, because monocular vision and binocular vision don't really vary in the respect that you cannot see the outward distance of something. You cannot see the outward curve of your own retina. This is why Gaussian curvature is nothing other than an explanation, a mathematical explanation for actually how your visible perception works. And his little minion, Mr. Bernhard Riemann, took the whole thing a little bit further and basically tried to separate the geometry of position from the geometry of motion. And the geometry of position is extremely, extremely important because it's the visible position of things in your visible space which determines also how you start to measure distances. So you need to go into that in more detail for people to understand. But the big picture here is that two-dimensional geometries, of which planar, spherical, and hyperbolic are all examples of two-dimensional geometries, not three-dimensional geometries. This is not a ball, it's a mathematical sphere that is embedded in a three-dimensional space, but you don't need to worry about this embedding in the three-dimensional space. You just need to look at the thing as a two-dimensional mathematical object, and it's that two-dimensional mathematical object that is the root of all these things we looked at earlier: astronomy, navigation, dialing, all the things that have been hijacked and are being told to as real, like looking at Spaceballs at millions of light years away. All that nonsense is basically hijacking the visible world and using mathematical sophistry of two-dimensional geometry to trick you. You've seen lots of obsessions with the all-seeing eye. I think that needs to be, as far as I'm concerned, a big red flag for people, an elephant in the room, when they see people continuously playing on these things. I'm not going to go into the conspiratorial details of all this, but it should be fucking obvious to people what they're up to. They're laughing in your fucking face. There's some more perspective information here. This is really just to make sure that people understand the difference between appearances and representations. If you look directly at something and there is nothing in between you and that object, then that would be an appearance. It appears, you apprehend something, it appears to you immediately and directly. If you have a representation of something, then that's when you have something in between you and the object. In this case, it's a house with a plane in front of it, and you're delineating what you see, or what you're delineating that object onto this planar surface. That's a representation. This can be done by mathematical rules, and this would be what we call perspective. But it's just a small part of the huge deception. People don't get bogged down too much in this perspective. And as I say, I'm fucking sick of hearing fucking debates and debates about this. So look at some of these things. It's important that you understand that it is always dependent on a given eye and a given situation, how you see things. The visible world is continuously changing. With every breath you take, objects are getting slightly further away, slightly left and right, and their visible shape and extension is changing all the time. Of course, it's because there's an external real world object that is in some way reflecting light and interacting with your eye. Yes, that's a given, but the fact is the visible world is a different world, and it needs to be described differently. It needs to be differentiated and discerned properly. Otherwise, people are going to tell you that what you see is really physical stuff, and it's not. It's a visible object of thought. It's a mathematical object of thought. Is a visible is a different from the mathematical object of thought, which we would call a physical. These are two completely different things, although they share the same spatial properties in that your eye is in your head and you're walking about on a physical plane. Yes, but if you close your eyes, you'll realize very quickly what you're missing when the visible world is no longer apparent to you or no longer present. So please, everybody, look at that difference and understand the big picture. There's a little PowerPoint here on gnomonic dialing, which I'm not going to jump into too much detail. I want to do more on this, but basically clocks and time have everything to do with the application of mathematical rules for perspective. That's all it is. You know, if you see a clock on the wall, people, it's because there's been a projection onto that surface using mathematics, not unsimilar to the stereographic projections or the gnomonic projections, which are used in navigation and other concepts like that. So of course this has to do with the luminaries that go around us. We're not fucking moving. Everybody knows we're not fucking moving. It's blatantly obvious. You do not feel anything. Don't let them tell you your senses are fallacious just because you don't understand how they work, or they won't tell you how they work, or they don't look closely into how they work. It's very obvious that they've ignored, for example, visible space But if they also tell you that you cannot feel motion sickness, then they're talking absolute fucking shite. So anyway, that's something that we'll come back to in more detail. There's a PowerPoint presentation on understanding how logic works and what first principles, on measuring natural stuff. Very important to understand how quantity is defined, what quantity actually means, what we do when we quantify things, what numbers we use, and complex numbers is a huge topic involved in this, which I'm going to dive into in more detail in the future too. But understand that when we quantify something and we're trying to map our phenomenal experiences and our sensory observations to quantifying the real world, then hey presto, our senses and our organs play a huge role in that, especially visual perception, but also other stuff. So how to measure, and so, you know, this whole empiricism is based on mathematical methods of measurement that need to be very carefully looked at, very carefully discerned so that people understand what's actually been said. Words, don't let them redefine the word level. A straight line is not a curve with zero curvature, just because they can reformulate certain words so that you then believe, oh, well, if it's a curve with no curvature, with zero curvature, it must mean there's positive curvature and negative curvature, and then they'll talk to you about sphericals and hyperbolics and all the other kind of geometries. But no, people, your real lived life is everything to do with Euclidean planar world. Don't let them redefine level. Water is level. Water is the very definition of what is level and what is parallel. And everybody then knows what the 90-degree perpendicular to that is. It's not the fucking line that goes to the center of a fucking spaceball fairy tale. No, it's straight up and straight down from the level of water. Don't let them redefine that. Zero, very difficult concept for people to get their head around. Zero is basically just a notation for merchants, for finances, for being able to calculate easier. Zero doesn't live in the natural world. There's no such thing as no tomato or no potato. Fairly obvious that that is also something that needs to be looked at. Here's a paper I wrote on the crappy argument for the globe that just because the Polaris will always be seen at the angle that is equal to your latitude, for them, that means that it's a proof of a globe. It's bullshit, yeah? I've taken the typical argument and deconstructed it and shown that if this is the argument they have for a ball and you're on the outside of the ball and you're measuring this angle and it's the same as the angle measured from the center of the Earth, then that's exactly the same as you can also use for a planar world and spherical vision. So if you're on this planar world here, then the fact that you have spherical vision means that Polaris dips in the sky approximately 1 degree for every of the latitudes, so that by the time you get to the equator, then the Polaris is going to be on the horizon. It's got fuck all to do with the fact that Polaris is some space ball billions of light years away. No, it's a light in the sky. It's obviously closer than we think. And yes, it is just absolutely subject to our natural perspective or our vision. I differentiate natural perspective when I say what I mean by the way we see things as to the mathematical rules to put them on a piece of paper, right? Let's always to say on these two things. I would prefer to call it direct vision or natural perspective, if you like, but it's not the word perspective per se. That does not mean the same thing. So this will explain to people exactly why the curve is in your eye and it's not that you're on a ball. All this stuff. This is an important for people who really want much more detail. This is a paper I wrote in August 2016 in a thread that is on the IFERS Forum. Let me just open up the IFERS Forum. For people who don't know this forum, it's the best one you should go to. Contains a lot of information. Let me just go to the homepage. This is set up by Eric Dubay, somebody who at least was my initial entry into the flat Earth after seeing his 200 Proust book and looking into it in more detail on my own, using my own discernment. This is the forum that Eric's had to rebuild, as far as I know, a couple of times because it kept getting taken down. And I just want to point out to a wealth of good information on here, good people. It's a no-nonsense forum where idiots are not tolerated and obvious shills neither. Now, there's all kinds of information in here about dubious characters. People should take what they will from this, make your own discernment. I'm certainly on board with a lot of what's been said on there. And I'd just like, obviously, to point out to people the thread that I started amongst all the other good ones here, where I tried to dive down deeply into direct vision, rationality, realism, and common sense. This was done in June 2016. Obviously, my research was a lot longer than that. Started in 2015. Took me a good year and a half or whatever to compile, verify, and all those things. But at the end of the day, what I wrote here back then is exactly what people should be looking at. We've been deceived into believing that we possess Euclidean vision, incapable of sensing an infinite non-Euclidean universe. The opposite is true. Our vision is non-Euclidean, and we are experiencing a finite Euclidean reality. There's lots of links and information in here to other things. People, please go down. I urge people to have a look at this. Again, not just because I'm wanting people to discern properly, and please don't think I'm blowing my own trumpet. I just want the proper information to be out there and not information that is confusing people. So this contains all the things that are still being talked about, a lot of it wrongly, that were said back in 2016 and explain these things. There's no need to make this more difficult than it is, people. So a shout out to Eric's forum, because as far as I'm concerned, it's still the most honest place to go and see compiled information from individuals who are genuinely seeking the truth with real inquiry, and not just in it to make money or have fame and stature. Back to this paper. This paper is quite big, and it contains all the information that I compiled, went through, remodeled. All the geometric diagrams here have been remodeled. Obviously, I've been influenced by various books. I can't even name them all, but all of these diagrams have been remodeled by myself, reworded to make them fully understandable what the difference is, and where perspective, and I am talking now about the mathematical rules and putting things on surfaces, of where perspective comes in, but also with a clarity in differentiating between perspective representations and appearances, appearances being those things subtended at the eye. So if you really want to understand the mathematical geometry behind perspective, then I can only urge you guys to read this paper. It took me quite a while, and I hope it's worthwhile to people. Yeah. Here's my big picture overview. We have been convinced that we live in a spherical world which we see through Euclidean eyes, but no, you're actually living in a Euclidean world down here, and you have a spherical eye. That is the big difference, and that's why they can just swap between these two things. It's why the mathematics works, because there are various laws of, there's the law of duality, there's projective geometry, there's a whole bunch of mathematical sophistry that would allow them to go from one to the other with absolute ease, yeah? And for people who are not being discerned, and that includes academics and mathematicians and physicists who are not properly discerning between these two visible worlds, can quite easily get conned into believing things that are not true. Also, a paper in here about the Socratic method. This was driven off the top of Dell's great activism and how he approaches people in the street, and my attempt to categorize it into a method that could be whatever, easier copied. Now, obviously, activism on the street is still the best way to get people into this topic. Don't lose yourself online, people. Don't let yourselves get burned up with a bunch of knob jockeys online. Get out there, talk to the real people, use a Socratic way of inquiring into what it is they believe and get them to question their own beliefs, get them to make their own experiences of the visible world, as an example, or any other topic. But that is the big one. There's no doubt about it. That's the one that they constantly use. Images on the TV, brainwashing in the school, or schooling. I reject the idea that it's education. For me, it's schooling. Yeah, so just make sure that you get out there, speak to people, and use a proper Socratic method. And don't get too lost, don't get dejected, don't get dismayed, discouraged by any of the online tactics. It's the real world, the real people that you want to be reaching and getting them to think differently about what they've been told. There's one little overview chart here that I tried to put together. A lot of these things help me, maybe more than they help anybody else, where I try to, at least for me, look at the things that are important in understanding this. Obviously, there's all kinds of things like, obviously, what I've talked about here, the visible space and the tangible space, which is basically part of our natural philosophy, i.e., the knowledge that we have of the world, of ourselves and of the external world. Then there's all these topics here which are immensely important. And of course, we can't forget the trivium, the grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the way they use language and words to manipulate how we think. Mathematics has now been a huge part of that. It's basically replaced religion in terms of people believing that mathematics is real and that maths is the language of God and all that pish. So basically, if you don't watch out, you'll be pulled into beliefs and religions and cosmological worldviews that are actually don't make any sense whatsoever. And instead, you should be looking very closely at the physical world that you live in, understanding how your mind works, what these different things are, what it is you do. And as soon as you understand that, then you can see through the bullshit. And, it's not space balls and hot gaseous balls floating through infinite vacuums of millions of light years away. No, it's little lights in the sky, people, and it's your visual perception that they're fucking with. One last one here that I hope is also, this is taken from Euclid's Optics, and basically just tells people when is a circle appear as a circle, because there's various phenomena that the globe believers and globe zealots would like you to not properly understand. For example, if you're at the center of a sphere and you're looking at the inside concave surface of that sphere, then any circle drawn on that field will always remain as a circle. It's not going to change into an ellipse. Yeah, that's just a fact, people of optics and light. So have a look at this paper. It's a little bit more geometrical in nature, but hopefully it helps people also understand geometry better and how the eye works. So for me, that was just a quick overview of stuff that I wanted to say, materials that are available on this public drive, which I hope people will make good use of. And again, I just want to point my frustration to people who continuously try and show this whole topic as a debate on the objective world. What a lot of nonsense. People doing that and expecting you to pay money to listen to conversations that continuously drone on about the same thing are, as far as I'm concerned, disingenuous and not real truth seekers. So, please just be careful where you direct your attention. I hope this information helps you. Look for the real sources of information, people. There's so much out there of real academics, also real people of genuine inquiry trying to make sense of this and trying to make this place a better world. And don't let people who don't have that as their highest priority suck you into their games and their nonsense. As I say, this is not going to be won by people making multiple images and arguing whether it's curvature or whether it's some other phenomena, from atmospheric lumining and lensing to all these minor details. And I hate to say this, people, but they are minor details in the big picture of the hijacking of visible and the physical world and the differentiation between the two. all these little things are symptoms of that bigger problem. So the quicker we get that into the mind of the people, that the differentiation between the visible and the physical world is the place where everything has been hijacked, the quicker we can get away from looking at just hundreds of small details and people getting lost and confused and bewildered when they're discussing that incessantly. Good. I'm just going to stop the screen sharing. I hope you guys can all see my face. I know I've ranted a little bit. This actually went longer than I intended to, so my apologies. Anybody who feels butthurt by anything I've said, suck it up. Fuck you. I don't give a shit. I'm fed up listening to all this crap for so long. For everybody else who hopefully takes my content the way it's supposed to be taken, neutrally, I'm not jabbing at anybody, but please, everybody, just have a look at this. Make that big picture discernment. Don't get lost in the details. Don't let people suck you into endless fucking debates. Let's get this going forward. Let's get this conversation, mathematics, optics, geometry, right to the root of the problem, so that people also in academia get shown up for what they really are, or what they're not doing, or what they're ignoring, or what they're too stupid to comprehend. I don't care which one it is. Yeah. Fuck it. I don't think I've got anything else to say, people. So see yous.